You're listening to Not From Here, a podcast for all of us, about all of us. This is the first episode of this podcast, so it makes sense to start from the beginning. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Alan Kraut, a university professor of history at American University and a non-resident fellow of the Migration Policy Institute. He specializes in immigration and ethnic history and the history of medicine in the United States and is the author or editor of 9 books and many articles. Professor Kraut's research has been supported by some of the most renowned institutions in the U.S. He is the president of the National Coalition for History, an elected fellow of the prestigious Society of American Historians, and received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society in 2017. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
I would like to start, so I like to start by asking people, like, what drove your interest to the field of immigration history in this?
So for me, it's a personal issue, but it also became an academic issue. When I was a graduate student, I was working a good deal on the anti-slavery movement, and I was, it was the era of civil rights, was the 1960s, and I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I began to work on an abolitionist third party called the Liberty Party. And I became very interested in voting behavior and who was voting for abolitionism and so on. And of course, when you start to look at votes, you also start to look at the voters and their identities and so on. And so I became interested in how the Irish immigrants of the 1840s and 50s were voting, the German immigrants of the 1840s and 50s. And so I began to develop more and more and more an interest in immigration. And while I moved away from the anti-slavery movement, I moved closer and closer to working on immigrants. And then I published my first book after I got my PhD. And my first book was called The Huddled Masses, The Immigrant in American Society, 1880 to the 1920s. And from there, it was just more and more and more about immigration in the stuff that I published, the articles and the books. And also, I became involved with the Ellis Island Restoration Project, and I became a member of the History Advisory Committee to that project. And now I chair the History Advisory Committee to the Park Service and to the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. So everything I do, what I teach, what I publish, and my life as a public historian is very much wound around the issue of immigration. And most recently, I've been consulting with the American Civil Liberties Union and filing amicus briefs in behalf of immigrants who are having trouble getting amnesty hearings, and children who have been separated from their parents because one or the other was denied an amnesty hearing. And so I'm involved with contemporary public events as well. And one of the things that I do, in addition to the teaching at American University, is that I'm a non-resident fellow of the Migration Policy Institute, which is a think tank here in Washington that deals with immigration issues. So again and again and again, I keep coming back to immigration and to the issues of social justice that surround it. Between those who came at other times and what we call mass immigration today. Obviously, the very first people on the North American continent were people who we sometimes refer to as Native Americans, or were once referred to as Indians, who came from North Central Asia across the Bering Straits thousands of years ago. And then, of course, Europeans who migrated and settled in North America, and then, of course, slaves who were forcibly brought. But those are all different categories of people who migrated, either willingly or not so willingly. But when we talk about mass immigration in the history of the United States, we're generally talking about large numbers of people who voluntarily migrated to the United States in search of economic opportunity or political freedom or religious liberty, any number of things. And that really began with the Irish migration of the 1830s and 40s. And then the German migration in the 1840s during a period of tumult and chaos in European politics. And so we've been having periods of mass migration throughout American history, right up to the present. I mean, we are in a moment of mass migration to the United States. These days, much of it coming from south of our border, but also from parts of Southeast Asia, parts of East Asia, Indians, Pakistanis, and so on. And so when I think about immigration or migration more broadly, it is deeply, deeply incorporated into the history of this country
Mm-hmm.
from early on.
What is, you said migration and immigration. So, how do you distinguish both? Is there a difference?
Well, yeah, well, yes, in the sense that migration means movement, the movement
Mm-hmm.
of people migrating from one place to another. And that can mean a transatlantic migration. It can mean internal migration within the United States after people have arrived. It can mean lots of different things. When we use the term immigration, it's a much narrower term, and it's a term usually reserved for describing people who are coming to the United States, uh, sometimes from uh, other places in the hemisphere or sometimes from the other side of the world. But
Mm.
they're coming to the United States, they're immigrating into the United States.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. So, can you talk also about how the federal government started getting involved in immigration policies? I heard in one of your talks as I was researching you, you talked about how they were not always involved in the policies. So, when and why did that change?
Yeah. I mean, for much of the first part of American history, immigration was a matter for the states to be concerned about. And there were state offices of immigration that monitored and counted immigrants who were arriving in the United States. It was very much a state issue. These were state officers who did this, and those who were conducting the medical inspection of newcomers were often volunteers from the
Mm.
private medical community. Things did not change, and immigration did not become a matter for the federal government until the late 19th century. And the reason for that is that it became increasingly difficult for states to manage the large numbers of immigrants who were coming to the United States. And it was believed that immigration was such an important issue and such a controversial issue for this country that it needed to be handled by the federal government. And so we see beginning in the 1880s, there's an immigration law, the Chinese exclusion law, that's passed by the Congress to exclude Chinese from emigrating to the United States, from arriving in the United States. And then by the 1890s, we see more general legislation that's dealing with how immigrants are going to be processed. And we see in 1892 the opening of Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island on the West Coast. Um, all of these federal facilities for um, monitoring and engaging in the inspection and interrogation of immigrants.
Mm.
And it has been a federal responsibility pretty much ever since.
How did the involvement of the federal government change the way Americans received and perceived immigrants from that point? Was there a change?
Well, I think the change is that immigration then became a national issue, and regulation of immigration was going to be by federal law. And when you think about the facilities at Ellis Island and other immigration depots, these are federal officers who are manning those stations and federal physicians who are conducting the inspection. And so immigration really becomes a very important national issue, and at times even an issue of American foreign policy. And it has been that way ever since. Um, Immigration has moved around the federal government. At one time, it was centered in the Commerce Department, and then the
Mm.
Labor Department, and then most recently moved into the Justice Department, and now into the Department of Homeland Security. So
Oh,
immigration has been seated in different places at different times in American history, but always with the understanding that the federal government has primary jurisdiction.
interesting. That's right. The Homeland Security Office didn't start until after 2001, right?
Right. That's
That's
right.
right.
Mhm.
Interesting. And just as a follow up, so you also mentioned the medical. I think you mentioned there were volunteers in the medical system and the checking, the medical checkup before they immigrated. So there was a point that immigration was only based on the medical records, right? If people were not sick, they were allowed in. Is that correct?
Oh, no, 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 that's not true at all. From very early on, the interrogation involved every aspect of the immigrant's life.
Hmm.
Immigrants were asked, do you have employment? How are you going to support yourself? And there was a lively correspondence between European police forces and the federal government in Washington to determine whether or not people who were criminals were attempting to come to the United States. Also, a great concern about the morality issue
Hmm.
and whether or not women were being trafficked into the United States to be prostitutes. So there's a lot of other issues that are involved. The medical issue became increasingly important as it became as we came to understand how disease travels. I mean, disease is also a traveler. In fact, the title of one of my books is "Silent Travelers," because germs and genes are travelers, but they are silent travelers on the bodies of immigrants.
Hmm.
And so we come to understand that there's a relationship, as we've seen quite recently, between people on the move and the movement of disease.
Right.
And germ theory, as we understand it, of what causes people to get sick, really was only truly developed in the 1880s by Robert Koch in Germany, Louis Pasteur in France,
Hmm.
and so on. And then it became increasingly important to understand the kind of harm that these genes, these pathogens could cause, and that they could be detected on the bodies of immigrants, and exclusion could be used as a public health measure.
Hmm. Interesting. Thanks for clarifying that. I had the impression that there was a point that it was lighter, but it's interesting. And as you're talking about um, looking into criminal records, I'm only thinking like if today immigration takes as long as it does, and we have all the technology to check on people, I can only imagine back in the day having to figure out by letters if they had any
Well,
criminal records.
immigrants were sometimes either um, rejected outright, or they were detained for lengthy periods of time until this correspondence could go back and forth. By the late 19th century, they were using, telegraph as well as letters and so on to try and clarify situations. But there was always a concern about the issue of crime and morality and
Mm,
immigration.
very interesting. Well, another thing that I heard you say, and I actually heard other historians say too, is that prejudice is a constant. And I've heard someone else also said, like, the immigrant comes and it doesn't take long for them to also become discriminate against other immigrants. So, can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think there is a fear of the foreign born, which we call xenophobia,
Mm.
and also a fear that American institutions are going to be damaged by the arrival of large numbers of foreign-born, which is one kind of xenophobia we sometimes refer to as nativism,
Mm.
a sort of protective feeling about American institutions, both economic and cultural, and so on. And that's been true throughout our history, as it is for many other countries as well. The outsider is always looked upon with suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
Are these outsiders going to be harmful to society? Are they going to be advantageous to society? How should they be treated? What are their legal rights? What is the possibility of them becoming eligible for citizenship and full membership in American society? These are some of the big questions that surround immigration and have always been matters of debate within the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people say, yes, fear of the immigrant, fear of the foreign born, concern about the foreign born is a constant in American history, I think that's quite true. I mean, there are some moments in American history when it's more detectable than others. We happen to be living in a moment right now where there's a great deal of anti immigrant sentiment
Mm-hmm.
and a great deal of suspicion. And yet at the same time, when anybody mentions the possibility of cutting off immigration completely, that doesn't seem like a very good option either, because immigrants are very important to the American economy,
Mm-hmm.
and they are very important in terms of America's cultural and social well-being also. And so that's what makes immigration so controversial is, which groups see immigrants as important and beneficial to America, and which groups see them as a danger and a threat in different ways.
Yeah. And I think from the immigrant side, I also wonder how much there is the psychology of trying to belong and detaching from what was, right? It's like I can't really be connected to that if I want to belong here. So I think a lot of people go into that other side of like, I'm here now, I don't want anyone else in kind of
Well,
attitude.
yeah, and that's part of the tension is on the one hand, uh, those who come to the United States want to blend in, they want to be accepted, they want to be embraced and integrated into American society. On the other hand, they have a past that comes with them,
Mm-hmm.
and many of those who arrive don't necessarily want to relinquish that past. And understandably, it's their identity. They
Right.
speak a particular language, they have certain preferences in terms of food and music, and they have a history, and they bring that with them. It comes with them as sure as their bodies, their appearance comes with them, and so it makes for a controversy on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Americans who are deciding who is acceptable and who is not, and newcomers who are deciding to what extent they want to be part of this country that they've come to, and to what extent do they want to simply work here, make money, and go home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you see both patterns all the time.
Yeah. No, as an immigrant myself, I think there is an internal conflict too, right? It's as someone who's been living in the US longer than I lived in my country of origin, is that question of like, when do you become a true American? And I don't know if I'll ever be, right? But it's that internal conflict.
Yes, I mean, as a young child, I often would be around when my granduncle was visiting the house and sat down with my grandfather, and they would be talking about the day's affairs, and I would be sitting on the floor or somewhere in a corner eating a cookie or something, and all of a sudden my granduncle would point to me and he would say, "There he is, the little American," uh, and he would say, "This is your country, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And because, in a sense, and I wrote about that years later when I was dedicating a book, and I mentioned that particular granduncle because he, in some sense, never quite felt like an American. He was always, to some extent, an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
But me, born in the United States, going to school in the United States, speaking English without an accent, that was a different story.
That's right.
And for him, that made me the American and him not quite.
Yeah, one of the topics that I want to touch on this podcast is the that first and second generation too, because you are, but then you go home and you're not, right? It's like
Yep,
you have a culture at home and you have a different culture outside of the house.
that's right.
Yeah, it's a for me it's a fascinating topic.
Well, you're living it.
Yes. Well, when I'm watching nephews and nieces, that is like, what does that look like for them to get home, have a different language, a different way of talking, the family, the entire family having a different accent than their friends, right? um, it's very interesting how they manage and um, how they know who they talk to in Spanish or in Portuguese and who they talk to in English. You know, they can navigate that from a very early age.
Yes, children learn that very early on. That's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. In what period of time America had the most immigrants coming in terms of percentage of population, and how that shaped the society?
Yeah, we're very close to that point right now. Approximately 13% uh, immigration. But earlier, it was closer to 14%. And that was in the period around 1907,
Mm.
which was a peak period of immigration, with large numbers of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as parts of Asia. It was a tremendous period of migration. Between the 1880s and the 1920s, 23.5 million people come to the United States just in that 40-year period. And that's a tremendous number of people coming and entering the economy, entering the society. And now we're up in that neighborhood. We're in the neighborhood of about 13%.
Is the expectation that will continue being high, or is it going to drop?
Well, it depends on a lot of different things. Because of COVID, migration has slowed down a good deal, but
Mm-hmm.
we're told that it's now picking up again. We see people gathering at our borders, trying to come into the United States um, because they need opportunity.
Mm.
And so I think it's likely to continue for a good long while, and understandably so. The United States, just because of our own birth rate, our own low birth rate, needs workers, needs consumers, needs people from abroad. And so uh, immigration is something that's very, very important to the United States. At the same time, as we said earlier, it always has been controversial and
Mm-hmm.
is very controversial right now.
Can you talk about how immigration shapes industries? So you talked about now how we are in a period that we need because low birth rates and everything. I'm also thinking just there has been all this discussion about jobs not being filled currently. Um, do immigrants play a role on that? And in the past, also, I've heard history stories, I guess, of the in New York City, the garment district being shaped by a lot of immigrants back in the day. So, can you talk about how immigration shapes different industries?
Yes, I think immigration has always shaped industry in the United States. If we go to the period before the Civil War into the 1850s, where it was largely Irish labor that was being used to build the railroads in the eastern part of the United States, the Chinese labor on the west coast of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So, construction, transportation, always using immigrant labor. Industry, as American industrialized, and we went through our industrial revolution very largely at the end of the 19th century. So many industries, whether it's talking about mining, factory work of different kinds, all involved immigrant workers. Um, you mentioned the garment industry a moment ago, and yes, many, many garment workers came to the United States from parts of Eastern Europe and prospered in the United States. My own grandfather was a garment worker in Poland, or what later became part of Ukraine, and then ended up in England in the Whitechapel district of London, where there was a garment trade. Some ended up in Paris, and then on to the United States, following the wages. Wherever the wages were
Mm-hmm.
higher, that's where they went. And you see this in other industries as well. And in modern industrial development, especially in places like Silicon Valley, how many firms have been started by people of foreign birth who've come to the United States and seen the tremendous opportunities that are available here, compared with their home countries where they were either being hampered by patterns of discrimination or patterns of exclusion, or limited economic capabilities. And so the United States has always been this place where opportunity exists for those with the energy and the will to take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you said your grandfather was from Poland and was in the garment industry, because that's exactly what I was listening to a Malcolm Gladwell book, and he was talking about Polish immigrants who were trained in doing making their own clothes and everything, and they
Sure.
saw an opportunity there, and they already had the training that other people locally didn't have.
Right.
You touched a little bit on how the pandemic is slowing immigration, and you and I kind of talked a little bit about climate change and how that's going to guide. So, how do you see immigration changing in the next few years, considering those different factors?
Well, we really don't know. I mean, what we do know is that right now we are kind of on the rim of a debate over immigration, a debate that everybody knows is necessary and nobody wants to have. And I was asked recently in an interview whether or not I thought during the lame duck session of the Congress right now there would be the introduction of legislation about immigration and whether or not that would be successful. I think not. I think we're not going to have that debate because it's too controversial and it's
Mm-hmm.
unlikely that anything would be passed. I think what we need and what we don't have right now is a kind of bipartisan willingness to make sense out of American immigration policy. And
Mm-hmm.
we've had things like this before. Back in the 1980s, we passed legislation, but prior to that legislation, the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, actually gave an amnesty to undocumented immigrants in the United States. These days, whenever anybody mentions the word amnesty, it ends the conversation on a dime. I mean, that's the end of it. Nobody is talking about amnesty for the undocumented, and yet there are so many undocumented in the United States, and they continue to perform such an important function. Plus, we have all of the people who have the dreamers,
Mm-hmm.
who have not been dealt with either. We keep getting promises that their situation is going to be regularized, but that hasn't happened either. Um, and so there's a big, big agenda with respect to immigration, and none of it is really coming to the forefront in terms of passing legislation right now. But we need to, because immigration is definitely a part of America's future. It's important. It has been important. It continues to be important. And the question is, how are we going to manage it? What I don't think we want to continue is what we've seen happening down on our border, where there's a lot of chaos, a lot of confusion, and the reaction of state governors talking about state government being involved. Look at governors like DeSantis and Abbott and others who are putting new arrivals on buses and sending them to cities in other parts of the country as a way of politically protesting the burden of immigration on their own states.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the problem is, of course, that's no solution. That's a protest, but it certainly isn't a solution. And we need solutions. We need constructive thinking about the whole process. Moreover, we probably need more involvement than we've ever had before in the federal government helping to settle newcomers and to manage the project of Americanization. You know, one of the things about our country is we have never had an Americanization project policy. That is, when newcomers learn English, they don't learn it by virtue of the federal government. The federal government doesn't pay for it. It's from, in churches, in public school systems in certain parts of the country, but not through any
Mm.
kind of federal management. The same is true of job training. The same is true of so many things, um, including distribution of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we have a refugee policy which provides funding to refugees, limited funding, while they get resettled in the United States. We don't have anything even vaguely like that for helping immigrants who are arriving in our country and may also need certain kinds of assistance. Um, Moreover, there's a lot of Americans who are very resentful of what they regard as immigrants taking up the space and resources that could go to poorer Americans, whether we're talking about native born Latino Americans, or we're talking about African Americans, or just white Anglo-Saxon Protestant poor people in the United States. There's this issue of how resources are to be expended.
Mm.
There's no policy with respect to spending differently for immigrants than for other groups. And so when lots of immigrants settle in an area and their children pour into the public schools and into the hospital clinics and emergency rooms, people who are not immigrants start to say, hey, wait a minute. We pay taxes, those are our resources, and here are these foreign born people who are benefiting from those resources. And that creates additional tensions and anger. So we need to deal with so many issues surrounding immigration that are problems for the United States and need to be dealt with.
I've heard of other countries that, I guess New Zealand and some European countries, that they focus on immigration and they focus on providing that what you're calling Americanization. They are providing the integration, right? Of like, we'll help you learn the language, we'll help you settle. It doesn't have to be tons of money, but I think there is the conscious of, if we do that, those people are actually generating more money to the country and the services that are needed. Because
Absolutely.
I think,
And on a much smaller scale, take a look at what the Israelis do. When you emigrate to Israel, the first thing they do is teach you the language.
mm-hmm,
You have to be able to communicate. There are all kinds of training programs for young people, for older people, um, because it's a country that's very much focused on and geared to the notion that people are coming there from elsewhere.
mm-hmm.
Um, and we acknowledge that, but we don't bankroll it. We don't control it. The process of Americanization always occurs, but it occurs privately, the state level at best.
When I was thinking about like New Zealand and some other countries, they don't only focus on immigrants that are highly educated, because they also have a shortage on labor work, right? That they need to bring in. So they also provide for that, because it's the immigrants coming in are filling a place that they need to be filled. So it's an interesting mentality, because we see that in America when you think about farmers and construction workers. Those are jobs that they're not stealing from the local. The local are not interested in taking those jobs. Like people in America, I'm generalizing, right? Because there's always differences, but it feels like they don't have the interest in becoming farmers. They don't have the interest in necessarily becoming construction workers, for several reasons. So there are gaps that need to be filled, and if it's done in a documented way, it can actually benefit everyone, because then you're also generating taxes, and then you're not looking at those folks going to the hospitals in this and the schools as they are taking from our tax dollars. You can look at, actually, they are also providing tax dollars, right?
Right. And that, and that's all the more reason to regulate it, to manage it, to
Mm-hmm.
supervise the process. Um, but right now the United States hasn't been doing that, and yet we're on the verge of a major influx of migrants. I mean, as
Mm-hmm.
soon as COVID really is under control, and it's not quite under control yet, um, then we're going to have to somehow somebody's going to have to deal with these other issues, and
Mm-hmm.
we see how governors are floundering around trying to deal with them in a kind of ad hoc way. Um,
Yeah. The way I see is being dealt with from a political standpoint of, like, now that half of America doesn't want immigration, then if we cannot do anything about it, because if we say anything to control it or to manage it, then it's seen as negative, right? And we lose votes. So it's hard to find that middle point when there's no rationalization.
that's right. You're certainly not going to find a political leader other than who rhetorically immigration is a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
who wants to advance a plan right now and overhaul the system. It's just not there. The the political energy for it isn't there.
Yeah. Do you think, like, looking at history, has immigration been not only seen, but has it been significantly different 50 or 100 years ago than what it is today?
Oh, enormously different in so many ways. Because 50 or 100 years ago, you didn't have the internet that ties people together, and all the other media, as well as the kinds of transportation. I mean, most immigrants who come to the United States are either coming um, by walking part of the way
Mm,
and hiring people to bring them into the United States, or if they're more affluent, they're flying into the United States. The era of vast steamships pulling into American harbors, that's not our era. Um, but the other factors are very, very important in tying people to their home country and allowing them to communicate constantly with people in their home country,
mm,
and also moving back and forth much more easily than ever before. And so I think all of that has made it different.
interesting. Do you see that as more, that ability to talk and to be on the internet and talk to people on the other side of the country? Do you think that's more of an attraction for people to become immigrants, or the other way around?
No, I think it's very much an attraction to be able to not only maintain a relationship with your home country and your relatives in a closer way,
Mm,
but also involves people in a multinational kind of way in the politics. I mean, we have overlapping citizenships.
mm-hmm.
You can be a citizen of this country, but also a citizen of another country at the same time. And in some cases, not all cases, you can vote in elections in both countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's very, very important. And again, the speed of transportation and the willingness to use it to go back and forth is very important. A number of years ago, it's quite a few years ago now, the New York Times ran a story of a man, Dominican background, who was living on the Upper West Side of New York City. And he got out to the airport, grabbed a plane down to the Dominican Republic where he had uh, economic interests and had lunch, and made a few business meetings, and then got back on a plane and was back in New York City in time for a very late supper. Now, think about that for a moment. What this
Mm-hmm.
guy did in the course of a day.
Mm-hmm.
That's transnationalism. That's true transnationalism. He
That
was
is fascinating.
participating in several economies, in business, uh, switching languages back and forth
Mm-hmm.
in the course of that day. And what made that day possible was the tremendous speed of transportation and communication that he that was at his um, disposal. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. That's the speed we're living nowadays too, which makes me think, right? Back in the day, you had to send letters and you had to wait and you had to get on ships to cross to other places, and now everything is just fast paced and moving, moving, moving.
Yes, that's right. It's an
Mm-hmm.
entirely different relationship to the environment
Yeah.
in which everybody is moving at a very fast pace, and the expectations are of speed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My last question for you, and I think you touched a little bit on this, is what do you think it would happen if the United States actually stopped welcoming immigrants?
Oh, I think it would be massive change, both from the standpoint of immigrant expectations, though there are other places to go other than the United States that do very well with immigrants. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, um, places like that that offer economic opportunities. But I think it would be deeply and profoundly damaging to the United States. And I think while certainly immigration has plenty of critics in the United States, uh, it's very rare to hear uh, an American politician with any credibility talk about ending immigration. It I mean, it sounds bizarre. It sounds silly
Mm-hmm.
because everybody knows how dependent the United States always has been and continues to be on replenishing its population, replenishing its talent, replenishing its creativity
Mm-hmm.
by welcoming the foreign born. Um, and So I don't see that happening realistically, and I think it would be an enormous tragedy for the United States if a politician actually succeeded in gaining election who really tried to shut down immigration to the United States. First of all, I don't think it would work anyway, but I think it would be very unrealistic.
Yeah, you mentioned the guy who went to Dominican Republic and back, right? And I think you touched on the innovation that immigrants can bring. And when you have someone speaking two languages who is able to do business in two countries and potentially bring business here, right, and bring that innovation here. I'm biased because I'm an immigrant, but I tend to think that you will lose a lot of innovation, which is so much of what the United States is built on.
That's right. I mean, again, just take a look and see what the background is of individuals who are operating out of Silicon Valley
Mm-hmm.
and who have been major creators and investors and so on. And there's a fairly significant percentage of people who are foreign born.
Yeah, I
And that
agree.
should tell you something.
Those are the questions I have. I don't know if there anything in related to immigration that you find fascinating, that you find surprising, that you want to share, or something that I didn't ask.
Yeah, you know, back in 1951, a historian named Oscar Handlin, who taught at Harvard University, published a book called The Uprooted. It eventually went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. And many modern immigration historians consider Handlin's book, The Uprooted, to be sort of the first modern work of immigration history. Um, and at the very beginning of the book, Handlin says, I set out to write a history of immigration in America only to discover that the history of America is the history of immigration.
Mm.
Uh, and I was privileged to meet Oscar Handler at the end of his life. And I believe very much what he believed, and that is that you can't really teach the history of the United States without teaching the history of immigration, of who came here, why they came here, what they did here, and what their children and grandchildren and great grandchildren have done here. And so, to that extent, writing the history of immigration is writing the history of the United States.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way to close this conversation. I think is right on point. It's great talking to you. Thank you again for taking the time. This was really great.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, remember to subscribe and share it with your network. The Not From Here podcast is a passion project currently self-funded. You can help us fund this project by donating at donorbox.org/not-from-here-podcast. The link is also on the description to make it a bit easier. Not From Here was created and hosted by Joanna Fugueiras. The music is by Alexi Action and was downloaded on Pixabay. Special thanks to Devashish Sengal, who helped with some of the editing.